All right, so in this video, we're going to start our last section of time period 3, and we're going to spend that looking at chapter 20. And chapter 20 is on what's going on in the Western Hemisphere. Now, we haven't really looked at the Western Hemisphere. And so what we're going to do today is going to be kind of similar to what we did when we looked at sub-Saharan Africa, and kind of do a quick recap of what's been going on in the Western Hemisphere, in the different regions of the Western Hemisphere, and then we'll get up to speed into time period 3. So we're going to break the Western Hemisphere down into 3 parts. So we're going to look today at Central America. And then in the next video, we're going to look at South America. And then in the last video on chapter 20, we'll look at North America and Oceania. So the area around Australia or the Pacific Islands. So today we'll look at Central America, so Mexico, kind of the area in between Mexico and South America, kind of north or south of where the United States is. So let's look at Central America in time periods 1 and 2. And what we'll see, looking at Central America in these earlier time periods, is that there's going to be a group of people that kind of act like the Bantu did in Africa. That these people are going to kind of act as a cultural anchor. And a lot of what we're going to see in time period 3 is as a result of these earlier people in Central America. So the first people to reach the Western Hemisphere came over from Africa. So they migrated from Africa across all of Eurasia to the small land bridge that linked what is now Russia with what is now Alaska. And the first people reached the Western Hemisphere around 12,000 BCE, about 14,000 years ago. And by about 9,500 BCE, people had reached the southern tip of South America. So over that 35 or 2,500 year period, people migrated into North America and then continued to migrate until all of North and South America had people in it. So the very first complex society in Central America were the Olmecs. And the Olmec society started around (1300) BCE. Now these guys are kind of centered along the southern coast of the Gulf of Mexico. On specifically the Yucatan Peninsula. So Florida kind of is the eastern edge of the Gulf of Mexico. The Yucatan Peninsula is the southern edge of the Gulf of Mexico. And that's where these guys were centered. So a lot of Olmec culture and society is going to be reflected in later societies. So just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what the Olmecs were all about. I think we've mentioned these guys briefly when we talked about ancient religion, but they were, there was a lot of sacrifice and bloodletting in their religious rituals. And that will be reflected in later societies. They had very extensive concepts of math and astronomy. And these led to very complex calendars used for agriculture and ceremonial purposes. So they had these really complex calendars that later societies are also going to use. So big things to keep in mind: the bloodletting and the sacrifice, calendars. One more thing that's kind of interesting is that they had this ritual rubber ball game that was used to settle disputes. From what I understand, this ball game is kind of like a mixture between soccer and volleyball and basketball, where you have to kind of use parts of your body other than your hands to knock this hard rubber ball through a hoop that was about 10 feet off the ground, and you'd score points that way. Usually the loser in this game was sacrificed. So it paid to be good at this ritual ball game. Now, around 400 BCE, the Olmecs kind of mysteriously vanished. It's not exactly clear why they vanished, but we do know around 400 BCE, the Olmec society collapsed, probably due to a mixture of invasion or climate change, climate disaster, but the Olmecs kind of mysteriously collapsed, and we're not 100% sure why they collapsed. Now, as we move into time period 2, Olmec culture is picked up by other people. So the Maya, who are probably most famous for their calendars, the Maya had city-states, much like the Greeks did. So the Maya had city-states at Teotihuacan and Chichen Itza. Both of these are still on the Yucatan Peninsula. so you could go visit these places. But the Maya also collapsed. And then towards the end of time period 2, into time period 3, Olmec and Maya society is picked up by the Toltecs. And that's where we're going to start into time period 3. So the Toltecs had a relatively large society. None of these societies are nearly as large as the societies we're seeing in the Eastern Hemisphere, but they were relatively large. Large for the Western Hemisphere. And they were, they had large cities, they had a military, they collected taxes. So the same kind of stuff that you would expect any other large, complex society to be doing, that's what the Toltecs are doing. Around the year 1175, a group of nomadic people from what is now northwest Mexico settled around Tula. Now, these people disrupted the Toltec society, and it eventually disintegrated. One of these nomadic groups gives Mexico its name. These people were called the Mexica. Now, the Mexica were known as being disruptive people. They were disruptive. They were militaristic. They were violent. And so they were nomadic because they kept getting pushed out of the areas they migrated into. So they'd move to a place, they'd pick fights, they'd break the laws, and they'd get pushed out because the settled society didn't want them around. Eventually, the Mexica settle around what is now central Mexico. On the shores of a lake. Lake Texcoco. And they settled here because they saw an omen. So in their religious tradition, if they saw this particular omen, that was their sign to settle down. And they saw this sign on the shore of Lake Texcoco. And this omen was an eagle on a cactus holding a snake. And if you're familiar with the flag of Mexico, That's what's on the flag of Mexico. So they settled on this lake, which nobody else really wanted to. This was basically open territory because the area around the lake was essentially just a giant swamp. So it was a giant swamp. No one wanted to live there. It was pretty inhospitable territory. Nobody really wanted to live here, but it actually turned out to be a pretty good place to live. It was easily defensible because to get to them, you'd have to travel through a swamp, which isn't easy to do. There's lots of food to eat in a swamp if you're not too picky. So there's lots of fish. There's also lots of bugs and frogs and, all sorts of animals that live in a swamp. And it actually provides a means to produce really fertile farmland. And here's how you do that. You basically dig up the soil from under the swamp, dry it out on the land, and that turns out to be like really excellent soil for farming. So this should remind you of essentially what the Egyptians did. So this is kind of similar to river flooding. Except they're having to do it manually. The river would flood itself. These guys have to do it by hand, but the process still works. This process has a name. It's called Chinampa. So the Chinampa system. Now, eventually, the Mexica and their capital at Tenochtitlan grow really powerful and wealthy. So they start using their military strength to kind of boss around their neighbors and tax them. They also formed alliances with rival city-states. So the city-states that were too powerful for them to just take over and tax, they formed alliances with. And the name of this alliance was called the Aztec Alliance. And that's what we know these people as. But the Aztec is the name of the alliance. And the Mexica were the largest group within this alliance. Now, the purpose of this alliance was to collect tribute from the neighboring people. That was the point. So, really, it was a very decentralized government. If you paid your taxes, the Aztec left you alone. Which sounds very similar to what the Mongols did in Russia. So it was a decentralized government. We see this in the Golden Horde. We see this in some places in Southeast Asia. Really, all the Aztec wanted was to collect taxes. And this is where we'll kind of leave off. So they're kind of at their peak in the 1400s. So they're kind of at their strongest in the 1400s. And that's kind of where we'll leave the Mexica until the Spanish show up at the beginning of time period 4. Now, we do know a little bit about Mexica society, and that's where we'll leave off in this video. So most of what we know about Mexica society comes through interviews with Aztec people and Spanish priests. So most of what we know about Mexica society comes secondhand. It comes through what the Spanish priests wrote down. We also have some knowledge that Spanish soldiers wrote down in their own journals as they conquered the Aztec. There are also a few pieces of Aztec writing that remained after the Spanish came through, but most of what we know comes secondhand through interviews that the Spanish did. But what we'll notice is that Mexica society looks very similar to what we would have seen in Eurasia. At the top, we have the military elite. So the military leaders, religious leaders, same as what we would see in other societies. Beneath them, like we might see elsewhere, were merchants. But merchants worked for the government. They were not independent. And so what the merchants did is they funded the military and the priests. So all the trading that was done through the merchants was controlled by the government. And then beneath them is everyone else. So everyone else is kind of at the bottom of society, commoners. So here you would have farmers or artisans, laborers, people who did stuff. We'll also note that Mexica society was very patriarchal, and women had almost no role in society. In fact, most women just simply hoped to give birth to sons. That was pretty much the role that women had. They were mothers. There was maybe they could be priestesses, but generally speaking, women had very few roles in Mexica society. The last thing we'll mention is that, like the societies that came before the Mexica, the religion was tightly connected to bloodletting and human sacrifice. And this becomes more common in the 1300s as a popular god associated with the military, becomes more popular. So, just a god associated with soldiers becomes more popular. And so what ends up happening is we get this cycle where the military would win, so we get victories, and the victories were attributed to sacrifices, which leads to more followers, which leads to more victories and more sacrifices and so on. So by the time the Spanish show up at the end of the 1400s, there is a large cycle of more and more human sacrifice going on, which means that they have to collect more and more victims, which means that the military has to go out and collect soldiers from enemy armies to sacrifice. And so when the Spanish do show up, this is kind of ramping up to a crescendo. But we'll stop there because around this time is when the Spanish do show up, and that's going to change things dramatically in the Western Hemisphere. So I'll stop there. Our next video will be looking at the Western Hemisphere, but this time we'll be looking at South America. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.